Before we begin, if you're enjoying this video, hit those hype points. Seriously. It helps this channel more than you could possibly know. Every single one makes a real difference, and if you have never thought about it before, just know that it genuinely matters more than you would ever expect. If you are listening to this on Spotify, leaving a review also helps out so much, and we genuinely appreciate every single one. It means the world to this channel. And hey, if you want to, drop a comment and tell us what time it is where you are right now, and where in the world you're tuning in from. Only if you feel like it, of course. But we love seeing where everyone is listening from Tokyo to Toronto, from Lagos to Los Angeles, from somewhere quiet and small that you have never seen on a map. It means everything to see this community spread across the globe. And if this is your first time here, and you are enjoying the content, hit subscribe. We make this kind of content every single week, and if this one keeps you up at night, or helps you fall asleep depending on which way it takes you, you're going to want to stick around. Alright, thank you. Now, let us get into it. Oh, and one more thing before we go any further. A massive, genuine thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this one. This topic has been sitting in the back of my mind for a long time now. The quiet they never explained. Here is something that should keep you up at night. Not a ghost story, not a serial killer lurking in the woods, not a haunted house or a cursed object or a creature in the basement waiting for the lights to go out. Something far, far worse than any of those things. The universe should be loud. Think about that for a moment. Actually sit with it. Let it settle in the way these things need to settle before they start to feel real. Before they stop being words and start being something heavier. Billions of galaxies, each one a staggering collection of light and matter and time, stretching across distances so enormous that the numbers we use to describe them stop meaning anything at all. Each galaxy containing hundreds of billions of stars, each star in many cases circled by worlds, trillions of planets scattered across the observable cosmos, spinning, orbiting, circling suns that have been burning for longer than human language has existed, longer than human civilization has existed, longer than humans have existed at all, worlds older than Earth by billions of years, worlds with oceans, worlds with atmosphere, worlds that, by every single scientific model we have ever constructed, by every simulation, every probability calculation, every line of reasoning that our greatest minds have ever committed to paper, should have produced life long before we ever crawled out of whatever primordial chemistry started us off on this particular rock. The universe should be screaming at us, radio signals, electromagnetic transmissions, the residual echoes of civilizations that have had millions, maybe tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions, of years more of a head start than we do. Signals that should be washing over us right now, at this very moment, as you listen to this, as you close your eyes, as you settle in and let the night do what the night does. Signals that should be so numerous, so layered, so constant, that the simple act of pointing a receiver at the sky should be like opening a door into a room where 1,000 conversations are happening at once. But there is nothing, nothing at all, and nobody, not one single scientist, not one astrophysicist, not one government official in any country on this planet, has ever given us a truly satisfying answer as to why. We have asked the question in 100 different ways. We have built the instruments. We have dedicated careers to it. We have poured money and talent and decades of collective effort into listening and listening and listening. And the sky has not answered. Not once. What if the silence is not natural? What if it is not a gap in our understanding, or a limitation of our technology, or simply the cold indifference of an empty cosmos stretching out in every direction with nothing in it? What if the silence is enforced? What if someone or something is keeping it quiet? Chapter 1. The question that started everything. On a warm afternoon in the summer of 1950, a group of physicists sat down to eat lunch at Los Alamos National Laboratory in the hills of New Mexico. The Second World War had ended 5 years before. The Manhattan Project, the enormous, secretive, world-altering effort to build the atomic bomb was long since finished. The tests had been conducted, the weapons had been built. The world had changed in ways that most of the people living in it were only beginning to understand. But the minds that had built it were still there, still gathered in that place, still turning over problems that most of the people on the surface of this planet would never have the capacity to even begin to understand. Los Alamos was, in many ways, the most concentrated collection of brilliant scientific minds that had ever existed in one location. The people who walked its corridors and sat in its cafeterias and worked in its laboratories were not ordinary scientists. They were the sharpest, most restless, most curious thinkers of their generation. People who looked at the world and saw not just what was there, but what might be there, what should be there, what the mathematics said had to be there, whether anyone had found it yet or not. The cafeteria was unremarkable. The food was unremarkable. The afternoon light coming through the windows was the kind of ordinary, unnoticed light that falls on millions of conversations every single day without anyone ever remembering it. There was nothing about that particular Tuesday that would have suggested to an outside observer that anything significant was about to happen. One of the minds at that table belonged to Enrico Fermi. Fermi was not just any physicist. He was not simply talented or well regarded or respected by his peers in the way that competent scientists are respected. He was one of the most genuinely brilliant scientific minds of the entire 20th century. He had won the Nobel Prize in physics. He had played a central, indispensable role in the development of nuclear energy. He had a gift, rare and remarkable, for looking at problems that seemed impossibly complex and reducing them, through intuition and calculation, to their essential structure. He understood the physical universe in ways that made most of his contemporaries look like promising students who still had a great deal to learn. And on that afternoon, somewhere between the main course and whatever came after it, Fermi looked up from his plate and asked a question. A question that was, on its surface, almost casual, almost offhand. The kind of thing you might say to fill a moment of silence at a lunch table, without any intention of it becoming the thing that everyone remembers you for, without any awareness that you're about to drop something into the conversation that will echo for decades. Where is everybody? He was not asking about the people in the cafeteria. He was not asking about the other physicists at Los Alamos, or the technicians, or the security personnel, or anyone else in the building. He was asking about the universe, about the scale of it, about the sheer, incomprehensible number of worlds and stars and galaxies that existed beyond the atmosphere of this one small planet, about the fact that the laws of physics, the same laws, the same constants, the same fundamental rules that governed everything from the smallest particle to the largest structure in the cosmos, applied everywhere, not just here, everywhere, and that, given enough time and enough worlds and enough of the right conditions, life should have arisen countless times over. So where are they? Where are the other civilizations? Where are the signals? Where is the evidence? Where, in all of that vast and ancient and incomprehensibly populated darkness, is everybody? The other scientists at the table laughed. It was a funny question in the moment, a good line, the kind of remark that gets a chuckle and a nod and then fades into the background noise of an ordinary lunch, forgotten by the end of the afternoon. But then they started thinking about it, really thinking about it, not as a joke, not as a casual observation, but as a genuine question with genuine implications, a question that, the more you turned it over, the more it refused to go away. And then they stopped laughing. That question, simple, devastating, and completely unanswered, became one of the most famous paradoxes in the history of science. It is called the Fermi paradox, and more than 7 decades later, despite everything we have learned, despite every telescope we have built, despite every signal we have searched for, despite the enormous advances in our understanding of how the universe works, we still do not have an answer. Not a real one, not one that holds up when you actually examine it, not one that accounts for everything we now know about how common the right conditions for life are, not one that satisfies the mathematics, or the observations, or the simple, nagging logic of the question itself? And that is where this story begins, with a question asked at a lunch table, in a place where the people who built the most destructive weapon in human history ate their food and talked about the cosmos, and one of them asked something that none of them could answer. What happened after that lunch was not what you might expect. It was not a sudden mobilization. It was not a race to the nearest telescope, a frantic effort to point something at the sky and start listening. It was slower than that, quieter. The question sat in the minds of the people who had heard it, and it stayed there. It grew. It changed shape over time, the way questions do when no one is able to answer them. And as it grew, it attracted other minds, other scientists, other thinkers, other people who looked at the universe and felt for the first time that something was missing from the picture. Not a piece of information, not a single discovery that would crack it open. A way of looking, a framework, a set of assumptions that everyone had been carrying without examining them. Assumptions about what the universe should sound like, about what intelligence does when it finds itself in a cosmos full of other intelligence, about whether the silence we hear when we listen to the sky is the kind of silence that means nothing is there, or the kind that means something very much is. Chapter 2. The Era of Hope. For a long time, after Fermi asked his question, we were optimistic. Genuinely, enthusiastically, publicly optimistic. The kind of optimism that gets written into grant proposals and spoken about at press conferences and woven into the public narrative of what science is capable of achieving. Through the 1960s and well into the 70s, there was a sustained and serious belief, not just among fringe thinkers or science fiction writers, but among legitimate, credentialed, peer-reviewed scientists working at real institutions with real funding, that we were going to find them. That contact with an extraterrestrial civilization was not a question of if, it was a question of when. That somewhere out there someone was transmitting, and all we needed to do was build the right equipment, point it in the right direction, and listen long enough. It was a beautiful idea. It was a hopeful idea. It was an idea that made the cosmos feel less like an empty and indifferent void stretching out in every direction with nothing in it, and more like a neighbourhood, a populated place, a place with other minds in it, a place where, if you looked hard enough and listened carefully enough, you might hear a neighbour on the other side of a very long fence say hello. The cultural moment matched the scientific enthusiasm. The space race was underway. Human beings had walked on the surface of the moon. The idea that we might soon hear from someone beyond our solar system felt, to many people, like the natural next step. The logical progression of everything we had already accomplished. We had left our planet. We had crossed the vacuum. We had proven that the cosmos was not beyond our reach. What could possibly be more exciting than the idea that it was not beyond the reach of others either? That others existed, out there, and that the distance between us might not be as uncrossable as we had always assumed. And the scientific community, fired up by that hope, threw resources and talent and ambition into the effort with a seriousness that had rarely been seen before in the pursuit of an answer to a question this large. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, was born directly out of this period of optimism. It was not a fringe project. It was not funded by conspiracy theorists or enthusiastic amateurs working in their backyards. It was a legitimate, serious, well-resourced scientific program, backed by respected institutions and supported by some of the sharpest minds in astrophysics. Massive radio telescopes were constructed across the globe. Enormous dishes of metal and wire, some of them the size of football fields, pointed at the sky, designed to capture the faintest possible whispers from the cosmos. Dedicated teams of scientists, people who had spent their entire careers studying the universe, who understood its rhythms and its noise and its patterns better than almost anyone alive, began the work of scanning the sky, frequency by frequency, direction by direction, hour by hour, day by day, week by week, looking for any sign, any flicker, any anomaly, any deviation from the expected background noise of an artificial signal buried somewhere in the vast ocean of natural transmissions that the universe constantly produces. The logic behind all of this was elegant and sound. If a civilization anywhere in the Milky Way had developed technology even slightly more advanced than ours, and remember, we're talking about civilizations that could be millions of years older than us, civilizations that have had time to refine and develop and perfect their technology far beyond anything we have achieved, they would almost certainly be using radio waves, or something very like them, to communicate. Radio waves travel at the speed of a light. They can cross the enormous distances between stars without degrading beyond detection. They are, in a very fundamental and practical sense, the most natural and efficient tool for a technologically advanced species to transmit information across the cosmos. So we built the dishes, we tuned them to the right frequencies, we pointed them at the sky, we hired the scientists and wrote the software, and set up the monitoring systems and began the long, patient work of listening. And we waited. The 1960s promised us the stars. The 70s kept that promise alive. Barely. Held up by cautious optimism and carefully worded projections. Scientists would speak publicly about timelines. Within decades, they said. Within our lifetimes, perhaps. We will know. The question is not whether we will hear something, but when. It was a lovely thing to believe, but the sky stayed quiet, and something started to shift. Not in the universe itself. The universe, as far as anyone could tell, had not changed, but in the minds and the institutions of the people who were listening to it. A slow, quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the way the search was talked about, in the way it was funded, in the way it was perceived, a shift that no one at the time could fully explain. Chapter 3. The Signal That Went Nowhere. On the night of August 15th, 1977, a radio telescope at Ohio State University picked up something that should have changed everything. Not in a small way. Not in a way that could be quietly filed away or explained by a natural phenomenon or attributed to instrument noise. In a way that should have stopped the world. That should have made headlines that people remember decades later. That should have shifted the entire conversation about whether we are alone in the universe. It was called the WOW signal, and it was, by every single measure available to the scientists who analysed it, the most compelling piece of evidence we have ever received, before or since, of an artificial transmission from somewhere beyond Earth. The signal lasted for 72 seconds. That was the entire duration the telescope was able to observe that particular section of sky as it slowly rotated through its sweep. 72 seconds. A remarkably short window. Enough time to capture something extraordinary. Not enough time to study it in real time, to respond to it, to do anything other than let it pass through the receiver and into the data. It came from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius, a region of sky that astronomers know well, a region that contains, among other things, the centre of the Milky Way galaxy, the dense, ancient, impossibly crowded core of our own cosmic neighbourhood, and it was extraordinarily, startlingly strong, far stronger than the background noise of the cosmos, far stronger than anything natural in that region of sky had any business producing, strong enough to stand out immediately from the surrounding data, strong enough that even a cursory review of the printout would flag it as something unusual, but the strength was not even the most remarkable thing about it. What made the WOW signal so genuinely astonishing? What made it the kind of event that scientists talk about in hushed tones decades later? Was how closely it matched the theoretical profile that the field had spent years constructing. For a long time before the WOW signal, scientists had been working on a detailed picture of what an artificial extraterrestrial signal should look like, what frequency it would use, what structure it would have, how it would stand out from the natural noise of the universe. It was a theoretical exercise built on the assumption that if anyone out there was transmitting, they would be doing so in a way that was detectable by the technology we were developing. The WOW signal matched that picture almost perfectly. The frequency, the structure, the intensity, the origin point, all of it, every single element, lined up in a way that made it, by the internal assessment of the people who detected it, deeply, uncomfortably compelling. This was not an ambiguous signal. This was not something that could be easily dismissed or explained away. This was, by the standards the field had set for itself, exactly what they had been looking for. Jerry Eamon was the astronomer on duty that night. A quiet, careful, methodical man who had spent years doing exactly this kind of work. Scanning the sky, reviewing data, looking for anomalies. Not the kind of person who jumps to conclusions. Not the kind of person who lets excitement override the discipline of careful analysis. When he came in the following morning and reviewed the data from the previous night's observation, he saw what had come through. He read the numbers. He looked at the pattern. He understood, immediately and completely, what he was looking at. He was so stunned, so genuinely, completely stunned, that he could not think of anything else to do but write a single word in red ink on the edge of the printout. Wow, that is how the signal got its name. Not from a press conference. Not from a scientific paper with a carefully chosen title. Not from a committee or an institution or an official statement. From a single word scrawled in the margin of a piece of paper by a man who had spent his entire career preparing for exactly this moment, and, when it finally arrived, had no idea what else to say. Now, here is what happened next. Or rather, and this is the part of the story that matters, the part that the conspiracy theorists seized on, the part that does not go away no matter how many times you examine it. Here is what did not happen next. The wow signal was never detected again. Not once. Not in the weeks that followed. Not in the months. Not in the years. Not in the decades of continued monitoring that came after, with increasingly powerful equipment and increasingly sophisticated analysis methods and increasingly desperate attempts to find it again. The signal came through once on one night for 72 seconds, and then it was gone. Completely and utterly gone. As if it had never existed at all. As if someone had reached into the data stream and removed it. No explanation has ever been confirmed. Theories have been proposed, of course, as theories always are when something unexplained shows up. Natural phenomena, passing comets trailing clouds of hydrogen that, in theory, could produce a signal with similar characteristics. Effects of the interstellar medium. Each one has been examined, discussed, debated, and ultimately found to be incomplete. Plausible in certain respects, but not fully convincing as a total and satisfying explanation for everything the signal was and everything it did and did not do. And none of them have addressed the fundamental strangeness at the heart of the event, which is this. If the wow signal was a natural phenomenon, then why was it so precisely, so perfectly aligned with what an artificial signal should look like? And if it was, artificial if for 72 seconds on a quiet night in Ohio, in a telescope that had been designed and built and operated specifically to detect exactly this kind of thing, we actually received a transmission from somewhere else. Then why did they never speak again? Why did they go silent? The conspiracy theorists saw something in that silence that the scientists were, perhaps understandably, not willing to say out loud. A pattern, a shape, a piece of a larger picture that the wow signal alone could not complete, but that it fit into with an uncomfortable precision. The most promising signal we have ever detected was also the only one, and it disappeared as cleanly as if someone had turned it off. There is a moment when you sit with the wow signal long enough, when the details stop being academic and start being visceral, when you stop reading about it and start feeling it. 72 seconds, that is all it was. 72 seconds of something extraordinary passing through a piece of equipment on a university campus in Ohio, and then gone forever. Think about what that means in practical terms. In 72 seconds, a person can barely finish a single thought. They can say a few sentences out loud. They can glance at a clock and look away and look back again. It is not a long time. It is not enough time to do much of anything. And yet in those 72 seconds, something extraordinary happened. Something that, if it was what it appeared to be, would have been the single most significant event in the history of human civilization. More significant than the invention of language. More significant than the development of agriculture or industry or nuclear energy or any of the other things we point to when we talk about the great turning points of our species. It would have been proof, actual, measurable, undeniable proof, that we are not alone. And then it was over. and it never came back. And we have spent decades trying to understand why, and the answer has not come. Some things, when you look at them honestly, do not have comfortable explanations. Chapter 4. The Quiet Shift. Something changed in the 1980s, and it did not change in the way that most things change in history. Not with a dramatic announcement, not with a press conference, not with a headline that everyone reads and remembers and argues about for years afterward. It changed quietly, institutionally, in the way that large organisations and government agencies make their adjustments, slowly, carefully, in meetings and memos and budget discussions that are never released to the public, in conversations that happen behind closed doors and leave no trace in the public record. Funding for SETI programmes began to decrease, not overnight, not in one clean, obvious cut that someone could point to and say there, that is the moment, that is the day it stopped. But gradually, persistently, almost imperceptibly, the flow of money into the search for extraterrestrial intelligence began to slow. Congressional committees that had once been supportive grew sceptical. The language in official documents shifted in tone and in emphasis. The rhetoric that had once sounded like anticipation, like the opening movement of something historic, began to sound like caution, like retreat. The sense that we were on the verge of a breakthrough, that contact was imminent, that the search for extraterrestrial intelligence was one of the great and defining endeavours of human civilization. That sense began to quietly, almost imperceptibly drain away, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, like air leaving a room through a crack that no one has noticed. The public messaging changed too. Scientists who had once spoken with enthusiasm and openness about the search, who had gone on television and into newspapers and made bold statements about timelines and probabilities, began to hedge their words with increasing care. The optimistic timelines disappeared from their statements. The language became measured, academic, precise in a way that felt less like confidence and more like someone choosing each word with an awareness of how it might be interpreted. Statements that had once sounded like promises began to sound like disclaimers, like legal language, like someone covering their tracks. And in the spaces where conspiracy theories lived and breathed, in the small publications and the late-night conversations and the forums and the books written by people who had been paying close attention to these questions for years, who had been watching the data and the funding and the public statements with a level of scrutiny that most people would never bother to apply, people started to ask a question, a very uncomfortable question. What if the scientists did not simply lose interest? What if they did not simply run out of money, or patience, or hope? What if the shift was not a natural cooling of enthusiasm, the way any research program might cool when it fails to produce results? What if they learned something? What if, somewhere in those quiet institutional conversations, in the rooms that the public never saw, in the documents that were never released, in the discussions that happened between people who had clearance and authority and access to information that no one else had, someone in a position of real authority realised something that fundamentally changed the picture? Something that made the search feel not just futile, but dangerous. Something that made the silence look less like an absence of information and more like an answer that no one wanted to say out loud. The theory that began to circulate in those circles went like this. By the early 1980s, enough data had been collected, enough analysis had been performed, enough of the mathematical and observational picture had come together that certain people in certain positions understood something new, something significant, something that the public was never told, and that the scientific establishment was not prepared, or perhaps not willing, to discuss openly. And that thing was this: advanced civilizations do not broadcast, not because they lack the technology, not because they have not thought of it, not because radio waves do not work over interstellar distances, not because of any technical limitation or physical constraint. They do not broadcast because they have learned not to. They have made a deliberate, conscious, informed decision to go silent, to remove themselves from the electromagnetic landscape, to stop announcing their existence to the cosmos. And the question that followed that realization, the question that keeps showing up at the center of this story, no matter which direction you approach it from, no matter how many times you circle back to it, was the one that should genuinely unsettle you. Why have they learned not to? What did they learn? What happened to the ones who did not learn it? And what does it mean for us, a species that has been broadcasting for over a century, loudly and enthusiastically and with absolutely no awareness of the consequences, that everyone else out there has gone quiet? There is a specific moment in this story that is worth examining closely. In 1993, the United States Congress voted to cut all federal funding for SETI, not to reduce it, not to restructure it or redirect it or scale it back for a few years while the budget was worked out, to end it, completely, in a single legislative stroke. The official justification was cost. The program was expensive. It had not produced results that justified its price tag. It was a reasonable argument on paper, the kind of argument that ends programs all the time in Washington. Nothing unusual about it, except for the timing. The vote came in the same decade that the tone of the entire conversation had shifted. The same decade that the scientists had gone quiet. The same decade that the optimistic language had been replaced by careful, measured lawyerly statements that seemed designed not to communicate but to avoid communicating. The vote came at exactly the moment when, if anyone in a position of real authority had learned something they did not want the public to know, cutting the funding would be the most efficient way to make sure no one kept looking. Private organisations picked up the work eventually. The search continued, in modified form, funded by individuals and foundations rather than the government. But it was no longer a national priority. It was no longer something the country was doing together publicly, with the full weight of its institutions behind it. It had become something else, something smaller, something that lived on the edges of the official conversation rather than at its centre. And the people who were paying attention noticed that, too. Chapter 5. The Predator in the Dark. There is a concept in evolutionary biology, old, well established, studied for generations by biologists who have spent their careers trying to understand how life persists in a world that is constantly trying to end it, that applies just as cleanly and just as coldly to civilizations as it does to the creatures that walk the surface of this planet. Silence is survival. Think about the animals that have persisted the longest on Earth, the species that have been here for hundreds of millions of years, adapting and enduring and evolving through extinction events that wiped out entire branches of life, events that killed 90% of everything alive, events that reset the board, and yet these species survived. They endured. They are still here. Many of them share a trait, not all of them, but many. They are quiet. They are still. They do not announce themselves. They do not broadcast their presence to the environment around them. They move through the world as invisibly as possible, revealing as little as they can about where they are, what they are, and what they are capable of. They have learned, over millions of years of evolution, that visibility is a liability. That being noticed is often the first step toward being destroyed. Because in nature, the things that announce themselves most loudly tend to become the things that disappear. Military doctrine understands this instinctively. It does not need to be taught. It does not need to be discovered through trial and error. It is built into the very foundation of how militaries think about warfare and strategy and survival. Stealth is not a luxury. It is not a refinement or a bonus or an optional enhancement. It is a fundamental survival strategy. The most dangerous military assets in history, the ones that have changed the balance of power, the ones that have made nations afraid, the ones that have proven, again and again, that the most effective force is the one that cannot be seen, have almost universally been the ones that could not be detected, could not be tracked, could not be found until it was far, far too late to do anything about them. They stay quiet. They stay hidden. They do not light up on radar or send out signals or make themselves known in any way that could be used to find them and stop them. Now apply that logic to the cosmos, not to a battlefield, not to a jungle or an ocean or any environment on this planet. Apply it to the largest possible scale, to the galaxy itself, to the space between stars where distances are so enormous that even light takes years to cross them. Where civilizations, if they exist, are separated from each other by gulfs of emptiness that dwarf anything human beings have ever travelled or can imagine travelling. If the universe is not empty, if there are civilizations out there, civilizations older and more advanced and more capable than anything we have ever imagined or dreamed of, then the central question is not simply whether they exist. The central question is what the dynamics of that environment actually look like, what the rules are, how intelligent life interacts with other intelligent life across those distances, whether contact is something that happens or something that is avoided. And one theory that gained serious traction, particularly in the 1980s and 90s, was this: that the universe is not a safe place for intelligent life, that it is in fact profoundly and consistently hostile to any civilization that makes itself known, that civilizations which broadcast, which transmit signals, which announce their existence, which make themselves visible in the electromagnetic landscape of the galaxy, become targets. Targets for what exactly remains deliberately vague in most versions of this theory. The specifics are left to the imagination, and in this case the imagination does not need much encouragement. The implication is clear enough without being spelled out in detail. Something is out there, something that responds to signals, something that, when it detects the presence of another intelligence in its vicinity, does not reach out in friendship. The universe may be full of life, teeming with it, bursting with it, but that life may have learned, through experience that we cannot begin to fathom, that the single worst thing you can do, the single most dangerous action any civilization can take, is let anyone know you are there. This is what has come to be known as the dark forest hypothesis, a name that carries with it exactly the kind of weight and atmosphere and dread it deserves. A name that, the more you think about it, the more it settles into you, and it is one of the most genuinely unsettling ideas to ever emerge from the study of the Fermi paradox. Because if it is true, if the dark forest is real, then the silence we hear when we look at the sky is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of camouflage. It is the silence of a million civilizations spread across the galaxy, all holding their breath at the same time, all listening, all waiting, all hoping that nothing has noticed them, and we are out here, broadcasting. The name itself, Dark Forest, was popularized by a Chinese science fiction writer named Liu Cixin, who built an entire trilogy of novels around it. But the underlying logic predates the label by decades. Scientists and philosophers had been circling the same idea long before anyone gave it a name that stuck. The name caught on because it does something that equations and probability models cannot. It gives you a feeling, and the feeling is this. Picture a forest at night. Not the kind of forest that exists in stories, with paths and clearings and creatures that are merely curious. A real forest. Dense. Lightless. Alive with things you cannot see and cannot hear until they are already close. And you are in it. And you do not know what else is in it. And the single most important thing you can do, the thing that every creature in that forest has learned through millions of years of evolution, is stay perfectly, completely, absolutely still. Do not move. Do not make a sound. Do not let anything know you are there. Because in a dark forest, the creature that moves first is almost always the one that does not survive the night. Now take that image and scale it, not to a forest, to a galaxy. Hundreds of billions of stars, each one potentially surrounded by worlds, each world potentially home to minds as sharp and as desperate to survive as anything that has ever lived on this planet. And every single one of them has learned the same thing, the same lesson, independently or perhaps not independently at all, perhaps taught, perhaps passed down from the ones who came before, and paid the price for not learning it soon enough. Stay still, stay quiet, stay alive. Quiet. Stay. Chapter 6. The Zoo That Stopped Being Benign. In 1965, a mathematician named John A. Wheeler proposed an idea that, at first glance, sounded almost playful, almost light-hearted. The kind of idea that gets brought up at academic dinner parties and discussed over wine with a kind of intellectual amusement. What if we are being watched? What if, somewhere out there in the darkness, a civilization far more advanced than anything humanity has ever produced. A civilization so advanced that it could observe us without our knowledge, without our detection, without us ever having any idea that it was there, is looking at us the way a zookeeper looks at the animals in a cage. Not with malice, not with any intention of interfering or harming or changing anything. Simply watching, observing, taking notes, studying us with the detached professional curiosity of a scientist examining a specimen that has been placed in a controlled environment for the purposes of research. It was called the zoo hypothesis, and for many years, for decades really, it was treated as a relatively gentle piece of speculation, a thought experiment, an intellectual exercise, a fun thing to turn over in your mind during a long walk or a quiet evening. Something to bring up at dinner parties or in university lecture halls as a way of asking the larger question, what if we are not alone, but not alone in the way we have always imagined? It was, in its original form, almost comforting. The idea that we were being watched, but watched with curiosity, not malice, observed but not threatened, monitored but left alone. It was in a strange way a hopeful version of the zoo hypothesis. It implied that intelligent life existed elsewhere in the galaxy. It implied that we had attracted its attention. It implied that we were interesting enough to study. But the zoo hypothesis did not stay gentle. Over the decades, as the silence from the cosmos continued to hold, as SETI listened and heard nothing, as the wow signal faded into unanswered questions, as the funding dried up and the optimism eroded, and the scientists who had once spoken so boldly about contact began to speak more and more cautiously about anything at all, the theory began to evolve, to shift, to darken, to take on a shape that was colder and more unsettling than anything Wheeler had originally conceived. The new version of the theory was not gentle at all. Earth is not simply being observed, it is being managed, deliberately, carefully, with purpose and intention, and a level of sustained, coordinated effort that implies not just curiosity, but policy. Active, ongoing policy. The silence around us is not a side effect of something else. It is not a byproduct of distance or indifference or the natural background noise of the cosmos drowning out any signals that might be directed at us. It is the goal. It is the outcome that someone, or something, is actively, continuously working to maintain. We are isolated, not accidentally, not as a consequence of geography or physics or the vast distances between stars, intentionally, deliberately. The silence that surrounds us on all sides is not the natural quiet of an empty universe. It is an enforced quiet, a maintained quiet, a quiet that requires effort to sustain, because without that effort, without someone actively working to maintain it, it would not exist. In this version of the theory, the monitoring is not passive. It is not a distant, detached observation from far away. It is constant. It is active and ongoing and extraordinarily careful, meticulous even. Any signal that might reach us, any transmission from any other civilization anywhere in the galaxy that might, if left unimpeded, make its way to our receivers and our telescopes and our listening ears, is being intercepted, filtered, suppressed, removed from the stream of information before we ever have the chance to know it was there. We live, in this framework, inside a bubble, a carefully constructed and meticulously maintained bubble of silence, a bubble that looks, from the inside, like the natural state of the cosmos, like the universe is simply empty, like there is nothing out there, but which is in reality a manufactured environment, a controlled space, a cage, if you want to use that word, that has been designed to look exactly like an empty universe. And everything outside that bubble, all of the signals, all of the transmissions, all of the voices that should be filling the sky, is being kept from reaching us. The wow signal, in this interpretation, takes on an entirely different meaning than it has in any of the other versions of this story. It is not a transmission that slipped through a crack in the filter. It is not an accident or an anomaly or a natural phenomenon that happened to look like something artificial. It is something else entirely. A test, perhaps. A deliberate probe, designed to see how we would respond when we received something we could not explain, something that did not fit into our model of the universe, something that challenged, even briefly, our assumption that we were alone. And when we responded with confusion and desperate, futile attempts to detect it again, when we wrote "wow" on a piece of paper and then spent decades trying to find it and never could, the test was complete. The information that was needed had been gathered. Whatever was watching us had learned what it needed to learn, and the signal was never meant to come back. It was not a message, it was an evaluation. Chapter 7. The Great Filter. There is a concept, a single idea, a single framework for thinking about the Fermi paradox that sits at the very centre of this entire conversation. A concept that is, without exaggeration and without any attempt at sensationalism, the most disturbing thing to ever be seriously proposed by a scientist in the context of the search for extraterrestrial life. It is called the Great Filter, and the logic behind it is clean and straightforward, which is precisely what makes it so deeply, uncomfortably unsettling. Because the logic does not allow you to look away. It does not allow you to dismiss it. It sits in front of you and it demands that you take it seriously, and the more seriously you take it, the worse it gets. For life to develop into a civilization capable of reaching other stars, for it to progress from the simplest possible chemistry, from the first stirrings of molecular complexity in a primordial ocean, all the way to a species that can build rockets and transmit signals and travel the distances between solar systems, it has to pass through a series of developmental stages. Each one is a hurdle. Each one is a transition that is, by its nature, difficult to make. Each one is a point at which the odds of success are significantly lower than the odds of failure. Simple chemistry becoming complex biology. The first spark of molecular organization becoming something that can reproduce itself. Single-celled life becoming multicellular organisms. Primitive life developing consciousness. Consciousness developing intelligence. Intelligence developing technology. Technological civilization developing the capability to travel between stars. At every single stage, the vast majority of attempts fail. The probability of making each transition successfully is low, and the probability of making all of them, every single one in the right sequence, without any of them destroying the civilization in the process, compounds downward with every step. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller. The Great Filter is the idea that somewhere in that sequence, at one particular stage, or possibly at several stages at once, the probability of success drops so dramatically, so catastrophically, that it becomes vanishingly small. A barrier so high, so absolute, so thoroughly resistant to being crossed, that almost nothing in the entire history of the universe has ever managed to get past it. Almost nothing. Now, here is the question that has haunted astrophysics for decades, the question that keeps scientists up at night, that gets discussed in quiet rooms at conferences, that surfaces in the margins of papers and in the conversations that happen after the official presentations are done and the cameras are off. Where is the Great Filter? Is it behind us? Is it one of the early stages, the leap from simple chemistry to complex biology perhaps, or the emergence of multicellular life, or the development of consciousness itself, that we have already, against extraordinary odds, successfully cleared, that we have already passed through without even realizing how rare and how unlikely that passage was? If that is the case, then the explanation for the silence is relatively simple, sobering perhaps, humbling certainly, but simple. We are rare, extraordinarily rare. We cleared a barrier that almost nothing else in the universe has ever cleared, and the silence we hear when we look at the sky is the silence of a cosmos in which events like us almost never happen. We are the exception, the freak occurrence, the one in a trillion accident that somehow made it through. Or is the Great Filter ahead of us? Is it something that civilizations consistently and reliably fail to pass once they reach a certain level of technological development? Something that destroys them, not gradually, not slowly, but completely and irreversibly, before they ever become capable of interstellar travel, nuclear war, environmental collapse, the development of artificial intelligence that turns against the minds that created it, biological catastrophe, resource depletion on a scale that no civilization can survive, something else, something we have not yet encountered, something that has quietly and consistently ended every civilization that has ever come before us, long before any of them ever had the chance to speak to anyone outside their own solar system. If the great filter is ahead of us, then the silence is not reassuring. It is not a puzzle to be solved or a mystery to be enjoyed. It is a warning written in the structure of the cosmos itself, a warning that says, something is coming, something that you will not survive, and every civilization that has ever reached the stage you have reached has failed to get past it. But there is a third possibility, a possibility that the scientists rarely discuss openly in conferences or in papers or in public statements, a possibility that lives in the quieter conversations, the ones that happen after hours, in the spaces between the official narrative and the things that people actually think when no one is watching. What if the great filter is not a natural phenomenon at all? What if it is not an inherent difficulty in the process of developing from simple life to a spacefaring civilization? What if it is not an impersonal barrier built into the structure of reality itself, like a wall that every civilization eventually runs into and cannot get past? What if it is enforced? What if the civilizations that clear the early hurdles, the ones that develop intelligence, that develop technology, that begin to look outward at the cosmos with curiosity and ambition, and the deep, restless desire to know what is out there, are not destroyed by their own mistakes or by the natural hazards of their environment? What if they are silenced, deliberately, specifically, by something that notices them when they begin to broadcast, when they begin to make noise, when they begin to announce themselves to the galaxy? What if the great filter is not a wall at all, but a door, and on the other side of that door, someone is holding it shut? Think about what that would mean in terms of scale. If the great filter is not a natural barrier, but an active mechanism, something that responds, something that acts, then the number of civilizations it has operated on is not small. Astronomers estimate that there could be billions of star systems in the Milky Way alone that have, at some point in their long histories, produced the conditions necessary for intelligent life. Billions, even if only a tiny fraction of those actually made it far enough to begin transmitting. That is still an enormous number. Thousands, at minimum, possibly tens of thousands, all of them silenced, not by accident, not by the slow, grinding pressure of entropy or resource depletion, or the kind of natural catastrophe that ends civilizations on a planetary scale, by something that was watching, something that detected the signal, something that, when it registered the electromagnetic signature of a mind looking outward into the cosmos, responded. And the civilizations that remain, the ones we hear nothing from, the ones that have gone so completely dark that their silence is indistinguishable from empty space, are the ones that figured it out. The ones that saw what happened to the others, or were told, or simply ran the same calculation and arrived at the same conclusion before it was too late. Stop transmitting. Go dark. Stay that way. That is what the great filter looks like when it is not a wall but a mechanism. Old, patient, precise, something that has been running quietly and consistently for longer than human civilization has existed, removing from the cosmic conversation anything that speaks too loudly, and we have been speaking very loudly indeed. Chapter 8. The signals we were never told about. There is a layer to this story that does not live in the textbooks or the press conferences, or the official summaries of what SETI has found and has not found over the decades of its existence. It does not live in the peer-reviewed papers or the government, reports or the carefully worded statements that institutions release to the public. It lives in the gaps, in the spaces where information should be, but is not. In the absences that, if you know what you are looking for, if you know how to read the shape of what is missing, become louder than anything that is actually there. Claims have surfaced over the decades, not from governments, not from named institutions with reputations to protect, but from individuals, people who worked, at various points in their careers, within the scientific and intelligence communities, people who had access to things that the general public did not, people who, for whatever reason, conscience or frustration, or a sense that the public deserved to know, decided to speak about what they had seen. And the story they told was not the story we'd been given. The claims go like this. Anomalous signals have been detected over the years, more than the public has ever been told about. Signals that did not match any known natural phenomena. Signals that were, by the internal assessment of the agencies and institutions that detected them, genuinely, seriously, uncomfortably unexplained. Not ambiguous, not borderline. Not the kind of signal that could be explained away by instrument error or atmospheric interference, or any of the 100 other explanations that scientists reach for when something does not fit their model. Genuinely unexplained. Requiring serious attention. Requiring quiet, careful, behind-closed-doors discussion among people with the authority and the clearance to have that discussion. But those signals were never made public. They were flagged. They were analysed. They were discussed in internal reports and internal meetings and internal assessments. And then they were filed. Quietly. Thoroughly. Completely. And they disappeared into the vast bureaucratic machinery of classification and institutional caution, as if they had never existed at all, as if no one had ever detected them. There are further suggestions, unconfirmed, unprovable with the information currently available to the public, but persistent in a way that does not go away no matter how many times you look at them, no matter how many times you try to explain them away, that monitoring programs exist, programs that go beyond what has ever been publicly acknowledged, programs that are not designed to search for signals, not designed to find them and study them and share them with the world, designed to detect and suppress them, to ensure that certain transmissions never reach the scientists who would study them, never reach the public who might ask questions about them, never enter the public record at all. Detection data, some have claimed, is filtered before it reaches the people who are supposed to be analysing it, that there is a consistent, systematic, deliberate gap between what the instruments actually receive and what the researchers are allowed to see, that the raw data and the processed data are not the same thing, that the difference between them is not random noise or technical error, or the kind of imprecision that naturally occurs in any scientific instrument, but something else, something intentional. None of this has been proven. You cannot prove the absence of something. You cannot demonstrate that a signal was suppressed, because by definition, if it was suppressed successfully, you would never have seen it in the first place. The nature of the claim makes it, almost by construction, impossible to verify through normal channels, and none of it has been officially denied either. That is the thing that matters. That is the detail that, if you pay attention to it, does not let you go. Not denial, not confirmation. Just a careful, maintained, perfectly calibrated absence of any official statement that directly and completely addresses the claims. A silence, and there is that word again, that looks from the outside like institutional caution. But that could also look like something else entirely. And if you have been paying attention to the shape of this story, if you have been following the thread from the beginning, from Fermi's question, through the era of hope and the wow signal, and the quiet shift in funding, and the dark forest, and the zoo hypothesis, then you have noticed something. The silence keeps showing up, over and over, at every level, in every layer, in the cosmos, in the institutions, in the records, in the official statements and the unofficial conversations and the spaces between what is said and what is not said. As if silence is not just what we find when we look at the universe, but what we find when we look at the people who are supposed to be helping us understand it. Chapter 9. The Crowded Sky. Here is the thing that makes all of this so much harder to sit with now than it was 50 or 60 years ago. The thing that turns this from an interesting puzzle into something genuinely unsettling. We know more. We know dramatically, overwhelmingly, undeniably more about the universe than we did when Fermi asked his question at that lunch table in 1950, or when the wow signal came through on a quiet night in Ohio, or when SETI was at its most hopeful, and the sky seemed like it was about to speak. We know more about the structure of the cosmos, more about how stars form and how planets form, and how solar systems organise themselves, more about the chemistry of space and the physics of atmosphere, and the conditions under which life might in principle arise. We know more about all of these things than any generation of human beings that has ever lived. And almost everything we have learned, every single piece of new information, every discovery, every observation that has come out of the last few decades of astronomy and astrophysics, has made the silence harder to explain. Not easier, harder, significantly uncomfortably, inescapably harder. In the last 2 decades, the discovery of exoplanets has fundamentally transformed our understanding of how common worlds are in this galaxy. When the search began in earnest, there were almost no confirmed planets orbiting other stars. The technology to detect them barely existed. We knew, in theory, that other stars might have planets, but we had not seen them. We had not confirmed them. And the assumption, the quiet, unexamined assumption that most people in the field carried with them, was that planets like Earth might be rare, that the specific combination of conditions that produced life here might be unusual, exceptional, a one-off. That assumption is gone now, completely and thoroughly gone, demolished by evidence, replaced by something that, in many ways, makes the Fermi paradox worse rather than better. We have confirmed the existence of thousands of planets orbiting other stars. Thousands! And the number keeps growing with every passing year, every new survey, every improvement in the instruments we use to look. Nearly every star we have examined closely enough has planets. Many of those stars have multiple planets. Some have systems that rival our own in complexity. Planets are not rare. They are not exceptional. They are not the unusual outcome of some unlikely cosmic event. They are ordinary, a feature of the galaxy, as common as the stars themselves, and among those thousands and thousands of worlds, we have found a remarkable and deeply significant number that sit in what astronomers call the habitable zone, the band of orbital distance from a star where conditions could, in principle, support liquid water on a planet's surface, where temperatures could fall within a range that permits the kind of chemistry that we know, that we have observed right here on Earth, can produce life, where, given enough time and the right ingredients and the right conditions persisting for long enough, the same process that started us off on this planet could, in theory, start something else off somewhere else entirely. Earth-like worlds, worlds with oceans potentially, worlds with thick atmospheres potentially, worlds with all of the raw materials and all of the conditions that were necessary in the right combination and the right sequence to produce everything we are and everything we have ever built. And they are everywhere. Not rare, not unusual, not the exception that proves the rule, common, abundant, spread across the galaxy in numbers that, when you actually look at the data, take your breath away. The universe, it turns out, is not a barren wasteland. It is not an empty expanse of cold and dark with one small, lucky island of life floating in the middle of it. It is a place that is, by every observable measure, full of the conditions that could produce life, full of the raw materials, full of the right environments, full of the time, billions and billions of uninterrupted years, for those conditions to do exactly what they did here, on this planet, in this solar system. The math demands it. The observations demand it. The sheer accumulated weight of the evidence demands it. And yet, still nothing answers. The Fermi paradox, in the light of everything we now know, is not less confusing than it was when Fermi first posed it on that afternoon in 1950. It is more confusing than it has ever been in its entire history. The conditions for life are not rare. The time is there, the ingredients are there, the environments are there. Everything that should be necessary, every single prerequisite to produce intelligent civilizations is there, in abundance, spread across the galaxy like seeds scattered on fertile ground by a hand that does not care whether they grow or not. And the sky is quiet. And the quiet is getting harder and harder to explain away with anything that does not require us to accept something deeply uncomfortable about the nature of our situation, something that most people, if they actually thought about it, would prefer not to think about at all. The uncomfortable thing is not simply that the universe might be empty. Emptiness, in its own way, is almost a relief. It is clean. It is simple. It means we are alone, and aloneness, however vast and however cold, is at least a thing we can understand. A thing that has a shape. A thing that does not require us to be afraid of anything other than our own smallness. The uncomfortable thing is the alternative. The alternative is that the universe is not empty at all. That it is full of minds and civilizations and intelligence that stretches back further than we can imagine, and that all of that intelligence, every single piece of it, has decided, for reasons that we do not understand and may never understand, to stay quiet. That is not the comfort of emptiness. That is something else entirely. That is the discomfort of company that has chosen, deliberately and consciously, not to speak. Not because it cannot, because it has decided not to, and the crowded sky, it turns out, is not a hopeful image at all. It is a haunting one, not because of what it contains, but because of all the voices in it that are holding their breath, all at the same time, for the same reason, a reason we're about to get to. Chapter 10. The warning. We were not meant to hear. There is a thread that runs through everything in this story. A single, persistent, unbroken thread that connects every piece of it. The Fermi paradox to the wow signal, to the funding cuts to the dark forest, to the zoo, hypothesis to the great filter, to the institutional silences and the suppressed data, and the carefully maintained absences where answers should be. And that thread is this. What if the silence is not a mystery at all? What if it is not a puzzle waiting to be solved? A question waiting for the right technology or the right mind or the right piece of evidence to crack it open and reveal what is underneath? What if the silence is in fact the answer? Not a message in the way we typically think of messages. Not something encoded in a specific frequency or transmitted deliberately from one point to another with the intention of being received and decoded and understood. But a message in a deeper and stranger sense. A signal embedded not in the electromagnetic spectrum, but in the structure of the situation itself. A communication written not in radio waves or mathematics or any language we would recognize, but in the simple, stark, inescapable fact of how quiet everything is. The silence itself is the message. The theory that has been building throughout this story, piece by piece, chapter by chapter, one uncomfortable realization leading to the next, comes to this. A single conclusion. A single idea that connects all of the pieces and makes them fit together in a way that nothing else does. There is a rule. Not a written rule. Not a rule that anyone has ever stated out loud in a press conference or published in a paper, or carved into stone somewhere for posterity, but a rule nonetheless. An unspoken, unwritten, but absolute and consistent pattern governing the behaviour of intelligent life in this galaxy. A pattern so pervasive, so universal, so thoroughly maintained across the entire span of cosmic history that it looks, from the outside, like a law of nature, like something built into the fabric of reality itself. The rule is this: remain unseen, do not broadcast, do not transmit, do not send signals into the void, do not light up the electromagnetic landscape with the evidence of your existence, do not announce yourself to the cosmos in any way, for any reason, under any circumstances, because something is listening. And the civilizations that broke that rule, the ones that spoke when they should have stayed silent, the ones that transmitted when they should have hidden, the ones that reached out into the dark with hope and curiosity and the deep instinctive desire to know whether they were alone, those civilizations are gone, not struggling, not declining, not fading away over millennia as their resources depleted or their societies collapsed or the natural entropy of things took its toll. Gone, quietly, completely, without a trace. The silence is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of compliance. It is the silence of every civilization in the galaxy that learned the lesson, some quickly, some slowly, some perhaps at tremendous cost, and made the rational and deeply frightened decision to go dark, to stop transmitting, to remove themselves from the electromagnetic landscape and disappear into the noise, the way a creature disappears into undergrowth when it hears something approaching, to stay dark forever. And humanity, young, loud, reckless, beautiful, naive, endlessly curious humanity has been doing the exact opposite for over 100 years. We have been broadcasting since the dawn of the radio age, since the first radio transmitters went up and began sending signals into the atmosphere and beyond, since television came along and added its own layer of electromagnetic noise to the sky, since we began deliberately, intentionally, enthusiastically transmitting into space. The Golden Records launched aboard the Voyager spacecraft, carrying with them the sounds and images and mathematics and music of our civilization. The Arecibo message, a deliberate transmission aimed at a star cluster, designed to say, here we are here, we exist. The countless other transmissions, deliberate and accidental, that have been leaving Earth and travelling outward into the cosmos at the speed of light for decades. A sphere of noise, expanding in every direction, growing larger with every passing year, announcing us to everything within range. If the rule is real, if the silence that surrounds us is truly the result of a shared, enforced universal agreement among intelligent civilizations to remain unseen, then we have already violated it, catastrophically, completely, thoroughly, without any awareness of what we were doing or what it might cost us. We have been shouting into a darkness that is not empty, for a very long time. Think about what that signal actually contains. Not just noise, not just the vague, indistinct hum of a civilization existing somewhere in the dark. A sphere of detailed, structured, unmistakably artificial information expanding outward from this planet at the speed of light, carrying with it everything we have ever broadcast into the sky. The first radio transmissions, early television signals, images, audio, entire programs beamed outward without a second thought. Decades of military radar pulses, sharp and deliberate and absolutely impossible to mistake for anything natural. The Apollo missions, satellite communications, the Arecibo message, a carefully designed, mathematically structured transmission aimed directly at a distant star cluster, built by human beings with the explicit intention of saying, we are here, we exist, this is where we are. If anything out there has the technology to detect electromagnetic signals at interstellar distances, and remember, we are talking about civilizations that could be millions of years more advanced than we are, then what they would pick up from Earth is not subtle, it is loud, it is detailed, it reveals not just our existence but our location, our level of technology, our intentions, and our almost total ignorance of the danger we might be in. We did not know we were doing it. Not really. Not in the way that matters. We did not understand what the first radio transmitter meant in the context of a galaxy that might have rules. Rules that every other civilization had already learned. Rules that we broke over and over without ever knowing they were there. We had been making noise in the dark, and we did not know that anyone was listening. And the question that remains, the question that this story has been building toward from the very first word, the question that sits underneath everything else in this story like a foundation, is not whether anyone heard us. Someone heard us. The question is what happens next. Epilogue. Listening too loud. Right now, in this moment, as you listen to this, as you settle in and let the night settle around you, there are radio telescopes on the surface of this planet pointing their vast and delicate receivers at the sky. They are scattered across continents, in deserts, and on mountain tops, and in the middle of remote valleys where the electromagnetic noise of human civilization is as low as it can be made. Some are enormous, dishes hundreds of meters across, structures so large that they dwarf everything near them, that change the shape of the landscape they sit in. Others are smaller, quieter, less dramatic to look at, but no less important in the work they do. They are all listening. They have been listening for decades. Patient, persistent, methodical, careful listening. Not the kind of listening that expects an answer. The kind of listening that has learned, over years and years of silence, to simply listen. To keep the receivers pointed at the sky and the data flowing and the analysis running, day after day, night after night, without expectation and without certainty and without any guarantee that the silence will ever break, scanning frequency after frequency, direction after direction, hour after hour, searching with extraordinary precision and extraordinary dedication for any flicker of intelligence in the noise of the cosmos, and they hear nothing. Nothing but the ambient hum of a universe that, by every calculation, every model, every observation we have ever made, should be alive with the voices of civilization stretching back, millions and millions of years before us, a universe that should be loud, that should be crowded, that should be so full of signals and transmissions and the electromagnetic evidence of intelligent minds that the simple act of pointing a receiver at the sky should be like opening a door into a room where everyone is talking at once, but the telescopes keep turning, the scientists keep watching, the data keeps flowing in, and the silence keeps holding. Maybe the universe is empty. Maybe we are a freak accident, a single, improbable, one in a trillion event on a single unremarkable planet, orbiting an unremarkable star in an unremarkable corner of an unremarkable galaxy. Maybe the great filter is behind us, and we cleared it, and the silence is simply the silence of a house in which no one else lives. A vast, cold, beautiful, empty house. Maybe. But if you have listened to this, if you have followed the thread from beginning to end, from Fermi's question to the wow signal, to the funding cuts, to the dark forest, to the zoo, hypothesis to the great filter, to the signals that were never reported to the rule that no one will say out loud, then you know that the empty house explanation does not quite fit. It does not fit the observations. It does not fit the mathematics. It does not fit the way the evidence points. And it does not fit the way the silence fits. The silence fits like a pattern, like a structure, like something deliberate and maintained and coordinated and shared across an entire galaxy of minds that all, independently or otherwise, reach the same conclusion at the same time. Or perhaps not independently at all, perhaps taught, perhaps learned from the ones who came before them and paid the price for not learning. Do not be loud, do not be seen, do not speak. Because the universe is not empty, it is just very, very quiet. And it has been quiet for a very, very long time, for a reason that we may not be ready to hear, a reason that, if we are very unlucky, we may be about to find out. The telescopes will keep listening, the scientists will keep watching, the data will keep coming in, night after night, year after year, and most of the time, almost all of the time, the silence will hold, the sky will stay quiet, the receivers will pick up nothing but the background hum of a universe that does not speak. But every now and then, someone will look at the data a little more closely than usual. Someone will notice something that does not quite fit. Something small. Something that could be explained away, probably, if you looked at it from the right angle, or applied the right correction, or attributed it to the right natural phenomenon. But that might not be any of those things. And if it is not, if any of those small, quiet, easily dismissible anomalies turn out to be something else entirely, then the silence will not have been empty after all. It will have been full of everything we were never meant to hear. The question is whether we are ready for that, whether any of us are. Stay quiet, stay still, and do not stop listening. Until next time, good night. Before we begin, if you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review means the world to us, and if you want, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening, and of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing really helps us keep bringing you these stories. Now let's get into it. They say power whispers, but in the California redwoods, beneath trees that have stood for centuries, power doesn't need to speak at all. It simply gathers and waits. Part 1. The recording. The camera was hidden in a hollowed-out book. Alex had carried it for 3 miles through the forest, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every snapped twig beneath his boots felt like a gunshot. Every shadow between the towering redwoods seemed to shift and watch. It was mid-July in the year 2000, and Alex Jones had just done something most journalists only fantasized about. He had infiltrated Bohemian Grove. The fence had been easier to climb than expected. No electric wire, no guards with dogs, just chain link and darkness and the smell of California pine heavy in the summer air. He'd studied satellite photos for weeks, memorized the layout, waited until the first night of the encampment when security would be focused inward, not out. The reconnaissance had taken months. Alex had spoken with former employees, kitchen staff who'd signed non-disclosure agreements, maintenance workers who'd seen things they couldn't legally discuss. Each conversation had been careful, coded. One former groundskeeper had drawn a map on a napkin in a diner outside Monterrio, then burned it in the ashtray before leaving. Another had simply said, "First Saturday night, after dark, stay in the trees." Now he crouched behind a massive redwood trunk watching. The bark pressed against his back, rough and ancient. Somewhere in the distance an owl, a real one, called out into the night. The sound seemed like a warning. Through the trees he could see firelight, hear voices, low, rhythmic, chanting. The sound rolled through the grove like distant thunder, raising goosebumps along his arms despite the warm night. It wasn't the words that unsettled him. He couldn't make those out yet, but the tone, the unified cadence of dozens of voices speaking as one. He pressed record. The camera captured what most of the world would never see. Dozens of figures in dark robes gathering in a clearing. At the centre stood something that didn't belong in any California forest. A stone owl towering 40 feet high, its blank eyes reflecting the flames below. The owl's face was impassive, carved with an almost Egyptian quality. Ancient, knowing, indifferent to human concerns. The ceremony was called the cremation of care. Alex didn't know that yet. He only knew that some of the most powerful men in America were standing in the darkness, wearing hoods, chanting at a stone idol while something burned in an effigy at its base. The effigy was human-shaped, wrapped in fabric, suspended above the flames by chains. As it burned, the chanting grew louder. His voice echoed across the clearing, amplified, theatrical, speaking in archaic language about casting off the burden of conscience, about freedom from responsibility, about 2 weeks of pure indulgence without guilt. Alex's finger stayed on the record button, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. He filmed for 17 minutes before he heard footsteps behind him. Heavy boots on forest floor, multiple people, moving with purpose. Security had spotted him, or someone had reported movement in the restricted zone. When he finally escaped back over that fence, footage secured, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely drive. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. He didn't stop at the motel where he'd been staying. He drove straight through, 5 hours back to the Bay Area, checking his rearview mirror every 30 seconds. The video would be uploaded within days, and the question it raised was simple, haunting, and impossible to fully answer. Why do the world's most powerful men gather in total secrecy to perform rituals in the woods? Part 2, The Beginning. 128 years earlier, in 1872, 5 men sat in a San Francisco tavern and decided to start a club. They were writers, journalists, artists, men who valued culture over commerce, poetry over profit. They called themselves bohemians, wanderers, freethinkers, people who rejected the rigid social structures of Gilded Age America. The founding members were modest in means but ambitious in spirit. Henry Edwards, a journalist for the San Francisco Examiner. James Bowman, a struggling painter whose landscapes never sold. Joseph Redding, a poet whose work appeared in small literary magazines nobody read. They met in cheap taverns, rented rooms above bakeries for meetings, staged plays in borrowed theatres. The Bohemian Club was born from good intentions. Their motto, borrowed from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, was elegant. Weaving spiders come not here. It meant business and politics were forbidden. Only art mattered, only creativity, only the meeting of minds unchained from the pursuit of wealth. For 27 years it stayed that way. The club met in the city, they performed plays, read poetry, debated philosophy. Membership was exclusive but modest. Journalists who couldn't afford lavish lifestyles, painters who worked in cramped studios, musicians who played for passion instead of pay. Annual dues were kept low deliberately, to ensure artists could afford to participate. Then, in 1899, everything changed. The club purchased 2,700 acres of ancient redwood forest north of San Francisco in Sonoma County. The money came from the wealthy patron, an industrialist named William Crocker, whose father had built the Central Pacific Railroad. Crocker wasn't an artist, he was a banker, but he appreciated culture, or so he said, and he wanted to support the club's vision. They called it Bohemian Grove. The first summer encampment was held that same year. 2 weeks of camping, drinking, performing plays beneath the trees. Members slept in tents, cooked over campfires, staged elaborate theatrical productions on outdoor stages they built themselves. It was supposed to be an escape, a place where creative souls could breathe. But money always follows beauty, and power always follows money. Within 5 years, the membership had shifted. Bankers joined, claiming an appreciation for the arts. Railroad executives attended performances and asked to become members. Oil magnates from Southern California heard about the Grove and requested invitations. The artists noticed, of course. They complained in private letters, in journal entries that would be discovered decades later. One founding member wrote, "We built a sanctuary from wealth, and wealth has followed us here. They dress as we do, speak as we do, but they are not us. They are tourists in our world." But the club needed money. Maintaining 2,700 acres of pristine forest wasn't cheap, and the wealthy patrons were generous. They funded new cabins, improved facilities, hired staff to manage the property. All they asked in return was membership, access. The artists told themselves it would be fine, that the motto still mattered, that business and politics would still be banned. They were wrong. Part 3. When the poets left. By 1905, the membership roles had shifted completely. Where there had once been struggling writers, there were now railroad tycoons. Where there had been painters, there were now bankers. Industrialists joined, oil magnates, men whose decisions shaped markets, cities, entire regions. The original artists didn't leave immediately. They stayed, watching their club transform around them. Some adapted, finding wealthy patrons among the new members. Others grew bitter, attending less frequently, until they stopped coming altogether. A few died, their obituaries noting their founding membership in the Bohemian Club, a detail that meant less with each passing year. The motto remained the same: "Weaving spiders come not here." But everyone knew it had become a lie. The business deals happened anyway, just quietly. A railroad executive and a mining company owner would take a walk through the forest discussing land rights. A banker and a politician would share drinks by the campfire talking about legislation. No formal contracts were signed at the Grove. That would violate the spirit of the motto. But understandings were reached, handshakes were exchanged, partnerships were formed. By the 1920s, the transformation was complete. Herbert Hoover attended regularly, years before becoming president. He was Secretary of Commerce at the time, and the Grove gave him access to the titans of American industry in an informal setting. Decisions that might take months of official meetings in Washington could be sketched out over a weekend in the Redwoods. Dwight Eisenhower was a regular guest in the 40s and 50s. A Supreme Allied commander during World War II, he'd become accustomed to making decisions of global consequence. The Grove offered something different, a place to network with the civilian leadership that controlled defence budgets, manufacturing capacity, political support. Richard Nixon came repeatedly throughout his career. He'd first attended in the late 40s, shortly after being elected to Congress. The Grove was where he made the connections that would carry him to the vice presidency, then the presidency, then ultimately to resignation in disgrace. But even after Watergate, Even after his political career had ended, he maintained his membership. Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr., Henry Kissinger, military leaders, intelligence officials, CEOs of companies that controlled more wealth than most nations. The list reads like a shadow government, and perhaps that's exactly what it was. The Bohemian Grove had evolved. It was no longer a retreat for artists. It was a gathering place for the architects of American power. And what happened there? What was discussed? What was decided? What was agreed upon in hushed conversations between men who shaped policy and war and economy remained locked behind walls of absolute secrecy. Part 4. The Manhattan Project. September 1942. The world was at war. Nazi Germany had swept across Europe, occupying France, bombing London into rubble, pushing deep into Soviet territory. Imperial Japan controlled the Pacific from mainland China to the Philippines. America had been pulled into the conflict less than a year earlier, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, still scrambling to mobilize an economy that had spent the previous decade in depression. That September, during the Bohemian Grove's annual encampment, a meeting occurred that would change human history. Present were some of the most brilliant scientific minds in America. Ernest Lawrence, a physicist who had invented the cyclotron and would win the Nobel Prize. J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist from Berkeley who spoke 6 languages and quoted Hindu scripture. Military officials whose names remain partially classified to this day, men who understood strategy and logistics and the brutal mathematics of total war. The meeting happened in a camp called Chowder and Marching Society. It wasn't a public gathering, no stage, no audience, no theatrical performance. Just a dozen men in a cabin talking late into the night. They drank scotch. They smoked cigarettes. They discussed the possibility of building a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. The physics was theoretical but promising. German scientists had discovered nuclear fission in 1938. Jewish physicists fleeing the Nazis had brought that knowledge to America, along with a terrifying certainty. If they could figure out how to weaponize atomic energy, so could Hitler. The question wasn't whether to build the bomb. The question was how quickly it could be done, and whether America could do it before Germany. No official minutes were recorded, no transcripts exist. But historians have confirmed the meeting happened. Lawrence's personal papers mention the Grove gathering. Oppenheimer's biographers reference conversations that took place there. Military records show that key personnel were granted leave to attend the encampment that year, despite wartime restrictions on travel. Shortly afterward, within weeks, the Manhattan Project was formally accelerated. Funding increased exponentially. Personnel expanded from dozens to thousands. Facilities were built in secret locations: Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, Los Alamos, New Mexico. The secret program to develop atomic weapons shifted into high gear. Conspiracy theorists point to this and ask a simple question. Did they plan the atomic bomb at Bohemian Grove? The answer is more complicated than yes or no. They didn't design the bomb there. The physics was developed in labs, the engineering in Los Alamos, the uranium enrichment in massive facilities that required industrial infrastructure. But the decision to move forward, the political will, the strategic coordination between military and scientific leadership, the allocation of resources on a scale never before attempted, may have crystallized in those private conversations beneath the redwoods. Think about what that means. The most consequential weapon in human history, the device that would kill hundreds of thousands at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the technology that would define global politics for the next 80 years. Its development may have been accelerated by conversations held at a private men's club, away from congressional oversight, away from public debate, away from any democratic process. No oversight, no press, no records, just power, talking to power, deciding the fate of the world over whiskey and campfire smoke. Part 5. The Owl. The stone owl stands at the edge of a small lake called Mirror Lake, 40 feet tall, carved from concrete and stone, its wings spread wide, its eyes empty and unblinking. The construction is crude by modern standards. The owl looks less like a majestic bird and more like an ancient idol, something that might be discovered in ruins of a forgotten civilization. At its base is a shrine, an altar where the cremation of care ceremony takes place every summer. The ritual happens on the first Saturday night of the encampment. Members are informed of the time through word of mouth. No printed schedules, no announcements. As sunset approaches, men begin gathering at their camps, changing into robes. Each camp has its own colour: red, black, green, brown. The robes are simple, hooded, monastic. By nightfall, hundreds of robed figures form a procession through the trees. They carry torches, real fire, not electric lights. The procession is silent except for the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. The path winds through the grove for nearly a mile before reaching Mirror Lake. The owl looms above them, lit from below by carefully positioned floodlights that make it appear even larger, more imposing. The lake reflects everything: the owl, the torches, the gathering crowd, creating the illusion of two ceremonies, one above and one below, mirror images in an ancient rite. When the procession is complete, the ceremony begins. It's elaborate, professionally produced. A sound system hidden in the trees broadcasts music, orchestral, dramatic, specifically composed for this ritual. There's narration delivered by a voice that booms across the water with theatrical gravitas. The narration tells a story. Care, the burden of conscience, arrives at the grove seeking to ruin the members' enjoyment. The owl, representing wisdom, representing the ancient knowledge that transcends human morality, rejects care, condemns it, orders it destroyed. Care is represented by a human-shaped effigy, suspended by chains above a pyre at the owl's base. As the narration reaches its climax, the effigy is lowered into the flames. It burns for several minutes while the robed figures watch in silence. The message is clear. For the next 2 weeks, these men are free from the burden of responsibility, free from guilt, free from the weight of their decisions. Care means worry, responsibility, conscience, guilt. The ceremony represents shedding those burdens. Officially, it's described as harmless theatre, a tradition dating back to the early 1920s, created by a member who was a professional theatre director. A way for powerful men to relax and forget the weight of their decisions. Nothing more than elaborate performance art, a bit of pageantry to mark the beginning of the encampment. But symbolism matters. When you tell the world's most influential leaders that they can, symbolically, ritually, burn away their sense of responsibility, what are you really doing? When CEOs who make decisions affecting thousands of employees watch care burn, what message do they receive? When politicians who control military budgets see conscience destroyed by fire, what permission are they being given? When generals who order troops into combat participate in a ritual that explicitly celebrates freedom from moral burden, what does that say about the wars they'll wage? Are you helping them relax? Or are you giving them permission? The owl is Minerva, they say, Roman goddess of wisdom. The ceremony is about wisdom transcending worry, about strategic thinking unencumbered by emotion. But Minerva was also the goddess of warfare, and wisdom without conscience is just calculation. Part 6. Nixon's Tape. August 1971. President Richard Nixon was in the Oval Office speaking with his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman. The conversation was recorded, as all conversations in Nixon's White House were, captured by the secret taping system that would eventually destroy his presidency. They were discussing the Bohemian Grove. The context is important. Nixon and Haldeman were talking about campaign strategy for the upcoming election. They'd been reviewing potential donors, discussing who to court, who to invite to White House dinners. Someone, the tape doesn't make clear who, had suggested reaching out to Bohemian Grove members. Nixon's response was immediate and visceral. The Bohemian Grove, I won't go into it, but it's the most effing goddamn thing you could ever imagine. The profanity was unusual for Nixon on tape. He cursed occasionally, but this was emphatic, emotional, the kind of language people use when describing something that genuinely disturbed them. He refused to elaborate. The recording cuts to a different topic, something about fundraising in California, details that seemed trivial compared to what had just been said. Whatever Nixon meant, whatever he saw or experienced or understood about the Grove, he never explained publicly. The comment was discovered years later during the Watergate investigation, buried in hours of White House recordings that were being analysed for evidence of obstruction of justice. People still debate what he meant. Was he disgusted by something he witnessed? Nixon had attended the Grove multiple times throughout his political career. He'd participated in the cremation of care ceremony. He'd networked with the members, built the relationships that would carry him to the presidency. But his comment suggested something more than simple distaste for theatre. Was he impressed in a way that troubled him? The phrase, "most goddamn thing you could imagine," could mean extraordinary, overwhelming beyond normal experience. Perhaps he'd seen the true extent of the power concentrated in those woods, and it had shaken something in him. Was he horrified? Nixon was many things, calculating, paranoid, ruthless when necessary, but he wasn't immune to moral consideration. The Watergate scandal showed his capacity for wrongdoing, but the tapes also showed a man who sometimes agonized over decisions, who understood the weight of presidential power. Perhaps something at the Grove had crossed a line he didn't want to discuss. Was he amused in a dark way? Nixon had a cynical streak. Maybe he found the whole thing absurd. Powerful men playing dress-up, performing elaborate rituals, taking themselves so seriously. But if it was just silly theatre, why refuse to explain it? The ambiguity is the point. If Bohemian Grove was just a social club, just a place where old men dressed up and performed silly rituals, why did the President of the United States refuse to describe it? What was he protecting? Or what was he afraid to reveal? Haldeman, for his part, never elaborated either. Years later, after serving time for his role in Watergate, he was occasionally asked about the Grove in interviews. He always deflected, changed the subject, or said simply, "It's a private club, members don't discuss it." But the tape remains. Nixon's voice, recorded without his knowledge, preserved for history. A sitting president in the privacy of the Oval Office, describing something he'd personally witnessed as the most goddamn thing you could imagine, and then refusing to explain what that meant. Part 7. The Rules. Bohemian Grove operates under rules so strict they resemble military classification protocols. The official rulebook is short, just a few pages, but every word is enforced absolutely. Violations lead to immediate expulsion. No appeals, no exceptions. Members who've belonged for decades have been banned for single infractions. No press allowed, ever. Not mainstream media, not independent journalists, not documentary filmmakers. No exceptions. Reporters who've attempted to enter have been detained by private security, sometimes turned over to local law enforcement on trespassing charges. The club's lawyers are aggressive about prosecution. No recording devices, cameras, phones, audio equipment, all banned. Members are expected to surrender electronics at entry, or leave them locked in cars. Some camps conduct electronic sweeps to ensure compliance. The prohibition is taken so seriously that even senior members have been expelled for photographing their own camp areas. No wives or female guests. The Grove is exclusively male. Women are not permitted on the grounds during the encampment, with the exception of a handful of staff members who serve meals and clean cabins. Even female family members of members, daughters, mothers, sisters, are prohibited. The only women allowed are those working in service positions. This rule in particular has generated criticism. Why exclude women entirely? The official explanation is tradition, a preservation of the club's original all-male culture. But critics point out that excluding half the population from a space where policy is discussed and power is consolidated effectively excludes women from certain networks of influence. No public statements. What happens at the Grove stays at the Grove. Members who violate this rule face permanent expulsion. The prohibition extends beyond just talking to press. Members are expected not to discuss Grove matters with anyone, including family members. There are stories of wives who never knew their husbands attended, who discovered the membership only after death when dealing with estate paperwork. There are accounts of children who grew up unaware their fathers disappeared for 2 weeks every July, told only that it was a business retreat or camping trip. Staff sign non-disclosure agreements that extend for decades. Even after leaving employment, they are legally bound not to discuss what they've seen or heard. The NDAs include substantial financial penalties for violations, amounts large enough to bankrupt most working-class people. Some former staff have reported receiving legal threats years after leaving, when the club suspected they might be considering talking to journalists. A former kitchen worker interviewed anonymously in the late 90s said, "I worked there for 3 summers. I saw things, heard things, but I signed papers saying I'd never discuss it, and those papers don't expire. Ever. They made that very clear." Conspiracy theorists argue that this level of secrecy exceeds anything necessary for a social club. If it's just theatre, just rich men playing dress-up in the woods, why the ironclad silence? Why the NDAs? Why the absolute prohibition on documentation? The official answer is privacy. Powerful people deserve a place to relax without scrutiny. Public figures, politicians, CEOs, generals, live under constant observation. Every word is analysed, every action is recorded, every decision is debated. The Grove offers freedom from that burden. A place to be human, to make mistakes, to speak without calculation. That answer would be more convincing if the Grove welcomed documentation that could prove its innocence. If rituals are harmless, why not allow filming? If conversations are purely social, why ban note-taking? If nothing illegal or unethical occurs, why threaten legal action against anyone who discusses what happens there? Privacy and secrecy are not the same thing. Privacy protects individuals from unwanted intrusion. Secrecy protects actions from accountability. The Grove's rules are designed for secrecy. Part 8. The Camps. Bohemian Grove is divided into more than 100 smaller camps, each with its own name, character and membership. Mandalay, Hillbillies, Caveman, Stowaway, Isle of Aves, Silverado Squatters, Lost Angels, Owl's Nest. The names range from whimsical to pretentious, but the hierarchy is real. Some camps are more prestigious than others. Some are older, more connected to power. Membership in certain camps is a signal of status within the Grove's internal social structure. Mandalay is considered the most elite. Its members have included multiple presidents, defense secretaries, Supreme Court justices. The camp is located in a prime spot within the Grove, close to the lake, surrounded by old-growth redwoods. The cabins are larger, better appointed. When members give lakeside talks, a daily tradition at the Grove, Mandalay members are given prime speaking slots. Hillbillies is another high-status camp with a membership that leans toward business leaders, CEOs of major corporations, private equity executives, venture capitalists. The camp throws elaborate parties, brings in expensive whiskey, hires musicians to perform. Caveman, despite its primitive name, is equally prestigious. Military leaders, intelligence officials, defense contractors. The camp has a reputation for serious conversations about national security, geopolitics, strategic planning. Lower status camps exist on the periphery of the Grove, housed in smaller cabins, with memberships that include newly inducted members, younger executives still building their careers, academics and artists who provide intellectual credibility but less practical power. Members spend their 2 weeks rotating between camps, attending lakeside talks, watching theatrical performances, drinking heavily, and most importantly, talking. The daily schedule at the Grove is structured but flexible. Mornings begin with breakfast at individual camps. Then members gather at the lakeside for talks, informal presentations on various topics, given by members or invited guests. Topics range from politics to technology to philosophy. Past speakers have included sitting presidents, Nobel Prize winners, top scientists. Afternoons are for socialising. Members wander between camps, join impromptu discussions, take walks through the forest. This is when the real networking happens. CEOs sit beside generals on fallen logs, discussing defence contracts. Politicians share drinks with intelligence officials, talking about foreign policy. Corporate executives have breakfast with Supreme Court justices, mentioning cases that might affect their businesses. Evenings bring theatrical performances on the Grove's outdoor stages. Productions are elaborate, professionally designed, performed by members who've rehearsed for months. Some are comedies, some are dramas, some are musical reviews. The quality varies, but the attendance is mandatory, a way to ensure all members gather together at least once daily. Late nights are for drinking and deeper conversations. This is when guards are lowered, when the formal structure dissolves, when friendships are cemented and alliances are formed. There are no aides present, no assistants, no one taking notes, no transcripts, no oversight, just conversation. And here's where conspiracy theories find their footing. In 1953, shortly after a Bohemian Grove encampment, the CIA launched Operation Ajax, overthrowing the democratically elected government of Iran and installing the Shah. Multiple attendees of that summer's Grove gathering were directly involved in planning the coup. Allen Dulles, CIA director, Kermit Roosevelt, the CIA officer who ran the operation on the ground, executives from oil companies that would benefit enormously from Iranian oil concessions. Coincidence? The official story is that Operation Ajax was planned in CIA headquarters, approved through proper channels, executed by trained operatives, and that's true. But the will to proceed, the decision that regime change was acceptable, that democracy could be sacrificed for strategic interests, may have been reinforced by conversations at the Grove. In 1967, energy policy discussions at the Grove preceded major shifts in American oil strategy. Executives from companies that profited enormously from those shifts were present. Within months, federal regulations changed, opening new areas for drilling, reducing environmental restrictions, providing tax benefits for oil production. Coincidence? Policy doesn't change in a vacuum. Someone has to advocate for it, someone has to convince legislators, someone has to coordinate between industry and government. The Grove provided a space for those conversations to happen informally, away from congressional hearings, away from public scrutiny. In 1989, defense contractors who attended the Grove saw their contracts renewed and expanded under the next administration. Many of those contractors had been camping alongside future cabinet members, sharing drinks, discussing the importance of military readiness, arguing for increased defense spending. Coincidence? In 2001, weeks after that summer's Grove encampment, the September 11th attacks occurred. The response, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the expansion of surveillance powers, the increase in defense and intelligence budgets, benefited many Grove members. Was the specific attack foreseeable? No. But the broader policy framework that enabled the response, the prioritization of security over liberty, the willingness to wage preemptive war, had been discussed at the Grove for years. Coincidence? No one can prove coordination. But the proximity, the casual, unrecorded mingling of people who later make decisions that align perfectly, raises questions that are impossible to dismiss entirely. Part 9. The Infiltrators. Alex Jones wasn't the first person to try to expose Bohemian Grove. He was just the first to bring back video. Before him, journalists had attempted to breach the perimeter. Most were caught, detained, and escorted off the property with threats of legal action. A few managed to observe from a distance but saw nothing conclusive. The Grove security was professional, experienced, thorough. In 1989, a team of activists from San Francisco attempted a coordinated infiltration. They planned for months, studying the layout, timing their approach for maximum confusion during the opening ceremony. 3 people made it over the fence. All 3 were caught within 30 minutes, detained in a security building, then handed over to local law enforcement on trespassing charges. They spent the night in jail. The charges were eventually dropped, but the message was clear. The Grove was protected, In the mid-90s, a freelance journalist named Rick posed as a service worker. He managed to get hired on kitchen staff, passed the background check, signed the NDA. He worked for 4 days before someone recognised him from a previous article he'd written about elite clubs. He was escorted off property immediately, threatened with a lawsuit for fraud and breach of contract. The lawsuit never materialised. The club likely didn't want the publicity, but Rick's notes and recordings were confiscated. In 2000, Alex Jones succeeded because he was brazen. He didn't sneak in like a spy. He walked in like he belonged. He studied how members moved, how they dressed, what they carried. On the night of the cremation of care ceremony, he simply walked through an entrance gate during a shift change, moving with purpose, looking like he had every right to be there. Security at the Grove follows a simple principle. People who belong act like they belong. They don't hesitate, don't look around nervously, don't question their right to access. Jones understood this. He wore dark clothing that could pass for staff uniform in dim light. He carried the hollowed-out book casually, like it was a notebook or prop for the ceremony. He moved toward the gathering crowd with confidence. Once in the crowd, he was invisible. Hundreds of robed figures, all anonymous, all focused on the ceremony. He positioned himself at the edge, behind a massive redwood trunk, and filmed for 17 minutes. The footage he captured showed exactly what Grove officials had always described: a theatrical ritual performed in robes, involving a stone owl and a symbolic burning. No human sacrifice, no occult summoning, no illegal activity, just theatre. But the image was undeniably strange. Powerful men in robes, chanting in unison, watching an effigy burn while a voice boomed about destroying care and conscience. The footage went viral when Jones released it, spawning countless conspiracy theories, documentaries, YouTube videos, and the fact that it was kept so secret, despite being just theatre, made people wonder what else might be hidden. British journalist John Ronson also infiltrated the Grove around the same time. He was researching a book about extremists and conspiracy theorists, and he wanted to see the Grove for himself. He attended as a guest of a member, not a full infiltration, but still a rare glimpse inside. His account, published in Them, Adventures with Extremists, was more measured than Jones's. He confirmed the rituals are real, the secrecy is absolute, and the membership includes some of the most powerful people in the world. But he also noted the strange disconnect between the ceremony's dramatic presentation and the casual atmosphere afterward. Members treated it like any other theatre performance, applauding at the end, then heading back to their camps for drinks. Ronson wrote, "The cremation of care is the most bizarre piece of theatre I've ever witnessed. But what struck me wasn't the ritual itself. It was how normal the participants found it. They'd been doing this for decades. It was tradition. And tradition, no matter how strange, becomes invisible to those who practice it." What neither infiltration could reveal was the content of private conversations. What was said in the cabins? What was discussed during late-night walks through the forest? What agreements, explicit or implicit, were reached over drinks and campfires? That remains unknown, and perhaps that's the point. The Grove doesn't hide its rituals because the rituals are sinister. It hides its conversations because the conversations are powerful. The cremation of care is theatre, strange theatre, symbolic theatre, theatre that reinforces a particular worldview, but theatre nonetheless. The real secret is what happens after the ceremony ends. Part 10. The Conspiracy. Let's be clear about what Bohemian Grove is not. It is not a site of human sacrifice. No credible evidence supports this. The rituals involve effigies, not people. Claims of ritual murder based on misinterpretation, deliberate misrepresentation, or outright fabrication. It is not a centre of occult magic. The owl symbolises Minerva, Roman goddess of wisdom. The ceremony is theatrical, not supernatural. There are no spells being cast, no demons being summoned, no supernatural forces being invoked. The participants are powerful, but they're not wizards. It is not illegal. Everything that happens at the Grove, so far as we know, is protected by privacy rights and freedom of association. Wealthy people are allowed to form private clubs. They're allowed to perform strange rituals. They're allowed to network with each other. None of that violates any law. But here's what it might be: a coordination space. A place where people who control industries, governments, and militaries can speak freely, without record, without oversight, and without the constraints of public accountability. Think about how policy normally works in a democracy. Proposed legislation is debated publicly. Congressional hearings are held. Interest groups lobby openly. The press covers developments. Citizens can track how their representatives vote, can pressure them, can vote them out if they disagree with their decisions. But what happens when the people making policy, or influencing those who make policy, can meet privately to coordinate positions before any public process begins? What happens when a CEO and a senator can agree on environmental regulations before any bill is introduced, ensuring the final legislation will benefit the CEO's company? What happens when a general and a defense contractor can discuss weapon systems before any Pentagon procurement process begins, ensuring the contractor's bid will be favoured? What happens when industry executives can brief politicians on their preferred policies, provide talking points, coordinate strategies, all before any congressional debate occurs? That's not illegal. But it subverts the democratic process. It creates a shadow channel where decisions are shaped before the public even knows there's a decision to be made. The Grove provides that channel, a bonding mechanism. Shared rituals create loyalty. When you've stood beside someone in a robe, chanting at an owl statue, you've shared something strange and intimate. That creates trust. That creates obligation. Psychological research on group bonding is clear. Shared experiences, especially unusual or emotionally significant experiences, create strong social ties. Military units use shared hardship to build cohesion. Fraternities use initiation rituals to create loyalty. Religious communities use ceremonies to reinforce belonging. The Bohemian Groves rituals serve the same function. When a CEO and a politician participate in the cremation of care together, they're not just watching theatre. They're engaging in a shared ritual that marks them as part of the same tribe. They're members of the same exclusive club. They've participated in the same strange ceremony. That creates a bond that transcends professional relationships. And bonds create obligations. If you're a senator and you need to make a decision that will affect a company, and the CEO of that company is a fellow Grove member who stood beside you at the cremation of care, that relationship affects your thinking. Not overtly, not through explicit corruption, but through the subtle influence of social connection, a pressure release valve. The cremation of care isn't just symbolic fun, it's a psychological tool. It tells participants they can temporarily shed moral weight. And if you're making decisions that affect millions of lives, that kind of psychological permission might be useful. Consider what these men do in their normal lives. CEOs make decisions that result in layoffs, that prioritise shareholders over workers, that externalise environmental costs onto communities. Politicians make decisions that send soldiers to war, that cut social programs to reduce deficits, that protect certain industries while others struggle. Generals make decisions that result in deaths, enemy deaths, civilian deaths, sometimes the deaths of their own troops. Those decisions have moral weight. Human psychology requires us to either justify those decisions or carry guilt about them. The cremation of care offers a third option: ritualise permission to stop caring, even temporarily, even symbolically. It's not that Grove members are cartoonishly evil, cackling as they burn effigies and plot world domination. It's that they've created a space where moral consideration can be set aside, where strategic thinking can proceed without the burden of conscience, where decisions can be made purely on the basis of power and benefit. None of this is provable, but correlation is compelling. When the same people who attend Bohemian Grove later shape policy, wage wars, shift economies, and redefine global power structures, and when those decisions consistently benefit the same small circle of attendees, questions are inevitable. The conspiracy isn't that they're worshipping Satan or performing dark magic. The conspiracy is that they've created a space where power can coordinate without accountability, where relationships can be built that transcend democratic oversight, where decisions can be shaped before the public even knows there's a decision to be made. That's subtle, that's sophisticated, that's far more disturbing than any ritual. Part 11. The present. Bohemian Grove still meets every summer. 2 weeks in July. Same location, same rituals, same secrecy. The encampment now occurs in the age of social media, satellite imagery, and ubiquitous surveillance technology. Yet somehow it remains largely hidden. The Grove has adapted its security to modern threats. Cell phone jammers are rumoured to be in use during sensitive gatherings. Drone detection systems protect against aerial photography. Digital surveillance of employees and members has intensified. Membership remains exclusive. Waiting lists stretch for years. Entry requires wealth, influence, or both. The initiation fee alone is tens of thousands of dollars, with annual dues to match. For most Americans, that cost is prohibitive. For the members, it's trivial. The demographics have shifted slightly over recent decades. While still overwhelmingly white and exclusively male, the Grove has admitted more tech CEOs, more international business leaders, more financiers from the globalized economy. The old guard, industrialists and politicians, share the camps with newer power brokers, venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, tech entrepreneurs. But the core purpose remains unchanged. Modern technology has made secrecy harder. Satellite imagery shows the layout. Anyone with Google Earth can see the camps, the stages, even the owl statue. Leaked membership lists circulate online, though the Grove denies their accuracy. Former staff occasionally break their NDAs and share fragments of stories, usually anonymously, usually with little concrete detail. But the core remains locked. No one outside the Grove knows what is said there. No one knows what deals are discussed. No one knows what coordination happens between the people who control the levers of power. In 2008, during the encampment, the financial crisis was already building. Members that summer included executives from banks that would soon fail, regulators who would be tasked with managing the collapse, politicians who would vote on bailout packages. What was discussed? What preparations were made? What understandings were reached about how the crisis would be managed? We don't know. In 2016, during the encampment, the presidential campaign was reaching its climax. Members included political operatives, major donors, media executives who would cover the race. What was discussed? What strategies were coordinated? What narratives were agreed upon? We don't know. In 2020, the encampment was cancelled due to the pandemic. For the first time in over a century, the Grove didn't meet. But in 2021, it resumed. Members included pharmaceutical executives, public health officials, politicians dealing with pandemic response. What was discussed about vaccine policy, about mandates, about the balance between public health and economic concerns? We don't know. And that's the real conspiracy. Not devil worship, not occult magic, not human sacrifice. Just power, gathering in private, away from scrutiny, talking without record. Epilogue. The question. Here's what we know for certain. Bohemian Grove exists. This isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. It's a registered private club with a physical address, property deeds, tax records. The world's most powerful men meet there every summer. Membership lists, partial, sometimes outdated but largely accurate, have been leaked over the years. They confirm the presence of presidents, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, generals, intelligence directors, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. They perform rituals involving a stone owl and symbolic burning. Alex Jones's footage confirmed this. John Ronson's account confirmed this. Even the Grove's official materials acknowledge the cremation of care ceremony. They enforce absolute secrecy. The rules are documented. The NDAs are real. The security is professional and serious. They have done this for over a century. Bohemian Grove's annual encampments began in 1899 and have continued with only rare interruptions ever since. Major historical events, the Manhattan Project, political coups, economic shifts, wars, have followed closely after Grove gatherings, involving people who attended those gatherings. The correlations are documented in historical records, biographies, declassified documents. Here's what we don't know, what they talk about. No recordings exist, no transcripts, no leaked documents describing specific conversations. What they decide. Do explicit agreements get made? Or is it all just informal networking? We don't know what they coordinate. Are strategies developed at the Grove later implemented in policy? Or are the connections purely social? We don't know. Whether any of it is illegal. Nothing we know about the Grove involves criminal activity. But legality and ethics aren't the same thing. Whether any of it should concern us. Is this just how power works in any society? Or is it a subversion of democratic principles? Reasonable people disagree. So the question isn't really, what happens at Bohemian Grove? The question is, why does the world's leadership need a place where no records exist? Think about that for a moment. These are people who run countries, corporations, militaries. Their decisions affect billions of people. Their policies shape economies, determine which nations prosper and which struggle, influence whether wars are fought or peace is maintained. Shouldn't those decisions be made transparently? Shouldn't the conversations that lead to those decisions be documented? Shouldn't the public have some window into how power is exercised on their behalf? The Grove's defenders argue that powerful people deserve privacy, that they need a space to speak freely without every word being analysed, that informal relationships and frank conversations are necessary for effective leadership. And there's truth in that, but there's also danger in it, because power without accountability tends toward abuse. Not always, not necessarily, but the tendency is there. Human psychology is clear on this. People in positions of power, insulated from consequences, gradually come to see their own interests and the public interest as identical. The Grove provides that insulation. It creates a space where the powerful can meet without oversight, can form relationships without transparency, can coordinate without accountability. Is it harmless networking? Is it strategic coordination? Or is it a reminder that real power operates best in the shadows, where questions can't be asked, where deals can't be documented, and where the people making decisions that shape our world never have to explain themselves? You decide, because the Grove isn't going anywhere, and neither are the secrets it keeps. Every July they gather, beneath the redwoods, around the owl, away from the world, and we're left outside watching shadows, asking questions, piecing together fragments of truth. Maybe that's exactly how they want it.